Hi, everyone. I'm just going to give everyone a minute or two to log in, and then we'll get started. Okay, thanks everyone for tuning in today. My name is Maggie Downing. I'm the manager of digital imaging at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia. Today we will be presenting the second episode of Digitization 201, which builds on the Digitization 101 series I presented over the summer. And these are all available now on our YouTube page. The episodes in this series are intended to be short, focused webinars on one topic related to digitization planning. So for Digitization 201, I've recruited other amazing expertise at the Conservation Center to help address issues of fundraising, handling original objects, and setting up a digitization studio. So today I'm here with Senior Paper Conservator Heather Hendry, and Heather works both in assessing overall collections and on treatments to conserve individual objects. Recent treatments at CCAHA have included screen prints by Andy Warhol, a hand-drawn 1782 map from the British occupation of New York, and albums of 19th century Chinese export watercolors. Heather specializes in the treatment and preservation of fine art on paper. And today, Heather and I will be discussing how to care for original materials during a digitization project. This series is presented with support from grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the William Penn Foundation. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available in the next day or two on our YouTube page. And throughout the webinar, I'll be monitoring the chat box for questions, and we will try to address all the questions at the end of this presentation. And I'm putting into the chat now a link to the original series, the Digitization 101, if you want to check that out, if you haven't already. So one of the things that the Conservation Center specializes in is digitizing fragile and difficult to handle materials that are commonly found in museums and archival collections. And some of these include brittle materials, oversized materials, rolled and warped documents, bound materials like books, works with friable media where the surface of the document may not be stable, and photographic materials. So today we're going to go into a little more detail about how we do that. Structure will be that Heather will give a few tips about safe handling for each of these types of materials, and then I'll chime in with some recommendations on digitization techniques and equipment types for each kind of material. So we'll start with brittle materials. Works on paper become brittle due to acidity that's found in wood pulp papers. They can also become brittle through light exposure and through fluctuations in temperature and humidity, particularly in the warmer and drier end of the spectrum. Brittle materials are extremely common in archives and are commonly seen in newspapers and some ephemera, and any collections that have been exposed to drastic fluctuations in temperature or humidity. Heather, could you talk about some other common materials that become brittle over time?
Well, in general, the most brittle papers come from the mid to late 19th century until the mid 20th century. This was really the golden age of wood pulp and alum rosin sizing. But almost any material can become brittle if it's stored in contact with acidic materials. And so a very good paper that's been in an acidic mat or framed up against wood on the back will become brittle over time. And the other thing I'd mention is plastics really stiffen up and get more brittle over time, like the negative that we're looking at in this picture.
Thanks. And handling these materials, even in just turning a page or flipping them over for digitization, can cause them to break or crumble. So Heather will be giving a couple tips on how to handle these materials.
Yeah, I think one of the first things you should be doing is assessing how brittle something is visually. And so I'm sure you've all seen how yellow newsprint gets. That happens right before it gets brittle. So those two really go together, even though they're separate phenomena. That's something that tells you there's going to be brittleness. Often the edges of paper will become more brittle than the center because the edges are more exposed to the atmosphere and they deteriorate faster. I would also keep a very close eye on the media, especially brown handwritten inks are often iron gall inks that can contain two sources of potential brittleness, either iron, which is rusting away the paper, or these inks can be very acidic, and so they're attacking the paper through acidity as well. In all these cases, you can still lift and handle these items, but they just need a lot more support. And so to start with, to get it up off the surface to begin with, you need to lift that edge very carefully. I don't like to see people using their fingers or even their fingernails because your fingernail actually will be a different length every single day. So it's not a reliable way to be picking up an object. We usually use micro spatulas, but something that works as well or even better is a sheet of card, like a business card or an index card that you can slide under. And so you see in the picture down there, that's giving a really nice even support as it lifts the edge. And whatever you do, you want to avoid flexing or bending it as well. Conservation treatment can help with brittleness, but there's definitely a time component you have to consider in terms of expense, that taking a photograph and recording that for posterity will be so much more time efficient than trying to remediate the brittleness that exists. And the strength cannot really be returned even through conservation treatment.
Awesome, thank you. So with those tips in mind, when you're digitizing materials that are brittle, you want to limit contact with the object as much as you can. So in these cases, an overhead scanner or a camera that's on a copy stand are safe bets because they require minimal handling of the original object. We don't generally recommend using a flatbed scanner for these because it can be difficult to lift a paper or a brittle negative off of the glass scan bed. And also because you have to press the object flat by pressing it with the scan top, which will come into direct contact with the object. So there's a little bit of extra handling when using a flatbed scanner. We also do not recommend using any equipment that uses automatic page turners or auto feed features. And this goes for everything that we are discussing today. Anything that where a machine is handling the materials is not going to be safe for your original objects. Another thing I like to mention, especially regarding newspapers, is to check to see if they're already digitized elsewhere. There's a lot of digitized newspapers in collections across the country and across the world in other archives. And so like a brittle newspaper collection can be difficult to handle and therefore very time consuming and costly to digitize. So if you can link your researchers to the material elsewhere, then you can focus on the more unique collections in your care for digitization. So next, I want to turn to oversize materials, which pose all sorts of handling and digitization and storage challenges. It's important to remember to find help when handling oversized materials and to communicate as you move the object. And Heather, can you give us a couple more tips for handling these more cumbersome objects?
Yeah, if you're moving something this big, you really need to think through the whole process before you get started. It's really important to make a plan before anything starts. And some of the things you have to consider is just at the beginning, getting it out of the folder. If it's in a folder, you might say my object fits on the table, but my folder is actually twice as big as the table. And then once you've opened the folder, you could pick up that object, but do you have another landing space to put it down on? You need to plan all that stuff out. And so like I think listed that you need 3 times as much space as your already large object, or else have a plan for someone to be closing the folder and whisking it away who's not busy holding your large object at the same time. If you're moving from one room to another, you have to really think out the path that you're going to travel as you do that. And even think of how high is the clearance up and down, as well as side to side, and everywhere that you're going to be moving. You'll probably need to work with a partner. And sort of as a rule of thumb, if you stop and think, do I need help in handling this? The answer is probably yes. And we all want to try and get stuff done and be efficient. But if you're thinking, maybe I need help to handle this safely, then I think you do need help. When you're moving things, you can pay attention to the paper itself and use the natural flex. So you see how we're handling this large poster. We're not keeping it perfectly rigid because we understand the material and we know that it can bend as we move it. So that gives us a lot more freedom as long as we're carefully bending it, not causing dents as we do that. If it's something that can't bend, you might need rigid boards to flip it like we have listed on our tips. This would be a way to keep something that large perfectly flat so that it won't suffer cracking from having to bend while you flip it.
Great, thank you. And so all of these tips go into the digitization as well. When you're digitizing oversized materials, you have a couple of options for equipment. You can work with a digital camera on a copy stand, like what I have shown in the bottom left image. And if your object is too large to capture in one photo, you can capture in multiple sections and then use a software program to stitch those into a single file. And if you do that, you want to account for extra file processing time in these cases. You can also work with an oversized table scanner like the one that's shown on the bottom right. These are very expensive, so unless you have a huge collection of oversized materials and a growing collection of oversized materials, you may want to outsource this to a digitization company that has equipment like this. It's best, again, not to use any machine-fed or pinch feed rollers, as this can damage the object as it feeds through the machine. And flatbed scanners are not generally a good bet for oversized materials because you'll always have some material hanging over the edge of the scanner, which you would need to support. And this can be pretty difficult, so we do advise against that. And this kind of translates into our next topic of rolled or warped documents, because a lot of times oversized materials are rolled. So this is something I always ask when I'm putting together a digitization estimate for a group of archival materials, is whether anything is stored rolled. And rolled documents can really slow down a digitization project because you need to have some extra handling involved, but it can be done in most cases. So Heather, can you give us some tips?
Well, sometimes things that are rolled can be really scary to open up. And I think you'll have a good sense if something can be unrolled or not. I would add that as you're checking the flexibility to see if something can be unrolled flat or if it's worked, if it can be pressed flat for the image, so that everything's in focus. The humidity of the object will really affect its flexibility on that day. And so we have a lot of humidity control in our lab, so it's very constant and doesn't vary much, but it may well be if you have less control over your environment, that could be something you could use to your advantage, that on very dry days, like in the middle of winter, that is not the best day to take on unrolling something because it's going to be a lot less flexible and a lot more brittle. As you're going, you should be also aware of any current splits or tears that could be a sign of weakness that could get worse. Something that you might want to consider, if it's simply not unrolling, you could do a separate stage of flattening, which may be a thing you need a conservator to advise on. It depends on the expertise within your institution. But once you're doing this object, you should also be considering as part of your plan how you will store it afterwards. So if you're unrolling it completely and you want to keep it flat after, which is generally better for the object if you can, that object is going to have a larger footprint when you put it back into your storage. If it's going to continue rolled, I would really like to see everything that is stored rolled to be supported on a tube after. And we recommend a sort of larger diameter tubes, like 3 inches at the minimum, I would say. And depending on your object, it could be 4 or 6 inches as well, so that you're not creating a really, really tight little roll. You're making a gentle roll so it will be able to unroll when you want to consult it. And we always say things should be rolled on the outside of the tube. And there's sometimes a natural inclination to put things inside of the tube to give it that protection. But that actually can lead to crunching and handling problems with pulling it in and out. So if you wrap it around the outside of the tube, it's completely supported, and you might wrap another cover over top to give it a little protection. But that'll actually keep it much more safely when you're done with digitization at the end of the day.
Super. And if your rolled documents do have the flexibility and are safe to handle for digitization without conservation first, you want to gently unroll it, and then you can use small weights along the edges to keep it in place and in plane with the camera. At the Conservation Center, we often use clear plexiglass weights, which appear less intrusive in the final image. But in some cases, the document will still have some dimension to it, like in the image on the top here. This is a mounted parchment, and that's, as you can see, that's about as flat as it's going to be with the treatment that it received. So in this case, we used a camera on a copy stand, and we were able to capture it all in focus because of the focal length we chose for the exposure. So even though there is some dimension in it, all of the information was in focus and sharp enough to read. And so we'll now move on to talking about bound materials. And these can seem fairly straightforward in terms of digitizing, but it's important to consider the physicality and the dimension of bound collections and all of the condition issues that can be involved with them.
Yeah, so the question of how much a book can open really differs for each book. And you really need to remain sensitive as you're opening it to feel when there starts to be resistance and be prepared to stop instead of being committed to opening it completely flat. And I would just want to also add, books can contain, besides their binding, they can have all the other condition issues we're talking about. They could also be brittle or stiff or oversized and have all the other problems, as well as having the spine to protect.
Certainly, yeah. And when you're considering digitization for books, you want to think about, again, how easily that book can open and have a plan for it as you move through the book. Or if you need extra support for it throughout the scanning. So in either case, you want to support the book on a cradle or an easel during capture. And we recommend a digital camera or an overhead scanner for digitizing books. Shown here are two options for a book copying easel that we use at the Conservation Center. In the top left image is a bound volume that opens fairly easily to 180 degrees. So we're able to shoot this actually as 2-page spreads. But as you can see in the image, each side of the book is resting on a separate panel that adjust independently and leave a gap for the spine. So even though we press with the glass to keep an even and in-plane image, we are not crushing the spine at all. And in the top right image is a solution for digitizing books that are too large for our easel or are too fragile to open all the way like that. So the volume in this picture is actually both. Shown here, we are digitizing one page at a time and supporting the other side at an angle with foam book cradles. Another advantage to using an overhead scanner or a camera is that you don't have to pick up the book, the full book, every time you want to turn the page, like if you were to be using a flatbed scanner. So in these two images where we're digitizing the book, all we have to do is lift the glass and turn the page, which greatly reduces the amount of handling on the volume during digitization. So next I want to talk about friable media. And this includes anything where the media is not stable on the surface, and you may risk smudging or flaking if you have anything in contact with the surface. So this is important to consider which of your collections contain these types of materials and how you'll handle them in your digitization planning. So Heather, can you give a couple tips here?
Yeah, so you want to be aware and really conscious of charcoal, pastel, and graphite, and also things that could be flaking, gouache, or any sort of watercolor that's either looks really matte or has a lot of white mixed into it can be prone to flaking. And the other thing to really watch is handwritten ink on parchment often does not bond that well. And because parchment continuously moves, it can start to pop off those little flecks. So those are the things to be aware of. You definitely just don't want to have anything in contact with them. And also be aware even of grime can transfer onto your hands. If you're handling very dirty objects, it's not the media that's getting lost, but you could quite quickly become too dirty to handle the next object you touch.
And so here again, we recommend, I sound like a broken record, but a camera on a copy stand or an overhead scanner, because you want to avoid as much as you can putting the surface of the object in contact with anything. So if you're using a flatbed scanner, you'd have to turn the object upside down and put it in direct contact with the scan bed. So again, those we recommend kind of what I've been recommending throughout this webinar. So the last type of materials we want to talk about is photographic materials. And these include prints and film negatives and glass negatives and slides and transparencies. So these types of materials are very common in archives and library collections. And we just wanted to say just a few words on handling them safely.
So the thing about photographic materials is this really brings up the glove question, and I don't recommend enforcing gloves for handling your entire collection, because in many times, if you're sacrificing your dexterity to prevent the fingerprints, then you're risking physical damage instead of the possible chemical damage. So I just recommend really clean hands in most cases, except for photographic materials and metal objects. And photographs actually have tiny amounts of metal embedded. That's what makes the image. So you should always wear gloves if you're handling anything that's photographic. And even if you are wearing gloves, please don't consider that a good idea to then touch the image, because with an older photograph, there could be many things going on with that emulsion layer that makes it more sensitive and cannot handle any contact, even if you're not leaving your fingerprints. I think that's my major tip for photographs, besides also being aware of brittleness or flaking as well.
And I will say here that for digitizing photographic materials, flatbed scanners do work great, just as long as they don't pose any of the challenges that we discussed earlier. So lots of flatbed scanners are capable of scanning transparencies. And depending on the scanner, you can obtain a very high resolution, which is usually what you want for smaller negatives and slides. If you're using a flatbed scanner for negatives, I do want to mention to watch out for Newtonian rings, which is an optical effect caused by the light from the scanner bouncing between the glass scan bed and the shiny surface of a negative. So I recommend doing a few tests to see if you're getting that effect. Some solutions to eliminating Newtonian rings include elevating the negative in a holder like the one shown on the bottom right, which usually come with the scanner if it has the capability of scanning negatives. You can also scan a negative emulsion side down if the emulsion side is stable and there's no flaking or grime on it. And another solution would be to place the negative on a translucent piece of plexiglass on the scan bed. With this solution, you do sacrifice a little bit of clarity and sharpness in the image, but it's another approach to that problem. If you have huge collections of slides and negatives, you can also consider using a dedicated negative scanner. And these may give you faster scan times than a flatbed scanner. But with that, they are a little less versatile since they can't also scan prints and flat documents. Digital cameras are also good for digitizing photographic prints. And you can even use the digital camera to photograph negatives by equipping it with a macro lens and capturing the negatives over a light box, like what is shown in the bottom left image. Photographing your negatives greatly reduces the time it takes to scan, and it's a good option if you have a large collection of slides or negatives and the technical expertise on staff. But this setup does take some more time and money to set up compared to a flatbed scanner or a negative scanner, which is an enclosed environment that can be pretty much set up wherever you have desk space. So I know I've discussed a lot of the limitations of flatbed scanners today, but in general, they're good and affordable tools for digitization, particularly for stable collections of small and unbound materials like correspondence, printed records, and photographic materials. And digital cameras and overhead scanners are great tools for some of the more challenging materials that we discussed today. So for more on equipment selection, I dedicated one episode of the Digitization 101, episode 6, which is available on our YouTube page. And I'm going to put a link to that in the chat box right now. Okay. So with that, these are some of the most common condition issues that we find in archives, libraries, and museums, and some tips for handling them safely throughout your digitization process. In this series and in the previous series, I talked a lot about camera and copy stand setups. So next month, I will be wrapping up this Digitization 201 series by talking specifically about how we set up a digitization studio using the CCAHA studios as examples. And my guest will be Andy Pinkham, who is our photographer. But for now, Heather and I are happy to take some questions, and I did see a few come in the chat box already, so I'll go up to the top there and start reading them. And if you think of a question later, our email addresses are right here, and feel free to reach out to us. So the first question comes from Nicholas Gardner. And he writes, for photographing on a copy stand for large objects, do you recommend considering a rail to smoothly move a camera and maintain the same Z axis? And I would say that's not really a necessary requirement. What we do at the Conservation Center is we just kind of move the object under the camera on a supported board. So we're not getting the exact same access or capturing on the same axis exactly. But the stitching software that we use, which is in Photoshop, is able to recognize this and automatically stitches the file together. But I would do some experiments with whatever software that you're anticipating to use and see how effective it is. The next question, Heather, will be to you. This is from Helen Smith. She asks, do you recommend rehumidifying before unrolling?
I do not recommend that if you do not have experience with it in the past. If this is something that you do in your institution or that someone else does, that's well worth considering. But there's a lot of dangers in humidifying in terms of inks can become so moist that they actually start to transfer or bleed just from high humidity. Things can become sticky and things can end up more warped than before once they dry out to normal. So I don't really recommend it unless you're prepared and you've done it before as a standard procedure for other reasons.
Okay, thanks. The next question is from Jacqueline Chi. Can you briefly discuss the practice of placing a sheet of glazing over top of materials for imaging? So we use a sheet of glass over our books when we're imaging them, and that helps keep each page flat and in the same exact plane with the camera. So as we move through the book, the pages don't appear smaller or larger as the distance from the camera changes. So we're always adjusting that and keeping it in plane with the glass. We don't generally place a whole sheet of glazing over larger materials. We can do that, but we generally just try to keep small weights at the edges to keep things in plane rather than placing a whole sheet because that can cause some issues with surface glare, or if there's any imperfections in the glazing, that's going to show up in the object as well. The next question is also from Nicholas Gardner. How do you feel about CZUR book scanners? Personally, I don't have any personal experience with it. We at the Conservation Center use the digital camera setup for pretty much all of our reflective digitization projects. So I don't have any specific advice to that, unfortunately. But I can recommend, Nicholas, I can send a couple links to review websites if you wanted to check out other options on the market as well. And do we have a recommendation for a color swatch when taking photos? Yes, and I talk about this again in the Digitization 101 episode on equipment selection. We do recommend, we use an X-Rite color chart for calibrating color, but there's a couple of other targets that I talk about in that episode. The next question is from Lillian Hansberry. What would be the best way to digitize glass lantern slides? Could that be a digital camera? It certainly could be. You want to make sure that you have a lens that can come in close enough to focus on the small object and get the resolution that you need from the slide. And you can also do some experiments with the flatbed scanner and see if you're getting a good quality effect there. The next question, maybe Heather, you could help with this one from Cliff. Do you have any recommendations for working with friable photographs where the image layer is flaking off?
If you've got flaking on your image layer, you should still be able to get a good image if you're taking a picture from overhead. In terms of what to do about your photograph in the future, besides just digitizing it, you should be starting it with nothing touching it and completely flat. So that photograph should be in a deep window mat so that nothing can touch it when it's in storage. And if you have the budget, that's the sort of thing that going to a conservator would help you to re-adhere all of those flaking bits so that you do not have to worry about it or lose any more.
Thank you. The next question is from Lauren. Are there suggestions or guidelines for how to transfer bulky, fragile materials, like a set of newspapers, to an outside vendor or for digitization? And for that, a general recommendation would be to use a fine art shipper or a dedicated handler rather than shipping it through via FedEx because of the fragility of it. But Heather, do you have any thoughts on packing for transport for these types of materials?
I think hopefully you're storing it in a fairly protective way to begin with. And so you should have folders that are larger than the object, and then a rigid container that's keeping things from flexing as well. And so if you could imagine several alkaline folders packed into a flat box with rigid sides, like a metal edged box, and then no loose space in the top. So if the box is not completely full, then putting in like a piece of ethafoam, which is a very neutral plastic, or something to completely fill it. And then again, working with a transport company that you can trust to carry the material flat, or else doing it yourself would be the other suggestion.
All right, thanks, Heather. There's a question from Ross. What software program do you recommend for stitching images together? We use the Adobe Photoshop. It's the Automate and Photo Merge feature, and we've had really good luck with that, stitching together files with only minimal kind of intervention afterwards. So we've had really good luck with that. We have a question from Bonita about some photo albums where photos are stuck in the albums and a few have writing on the back, which is just visible if gently lifting a corner. Do you recommend taking the photos off the pages? And if so, how should I do that? I think in general, we would recommend having a conservator take a look at this if the photos are stuck into the album with any type of adhesive, if you want to capture the writing on the back. Heather, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I completely agree with that. If these photos are not replaceable, I do not think you want to risk the damage of pulling them off yourself. You should speak with a conservator.
And we've got a couple comments, and then last question from Taha. I would like to ask a general question. Do you think every museum should digitize their collection? And what are the benefits of digitization? Oh, some big picture questions to kind of wrap up. There's a lot of benefits to digitizing collections. And I think one of the major advantages that we're seeing now is that you can still reach your audiences even when they can't physically visit the material. So with a lot of the museum closures and library closures due to COVID, you can still make your materials accessible to researchers and the public by having the images available online. And other benefits include just being able to share across geographic regions to researchers and being able to kind of pull different pieces of information together in a way that wasn't possible by having to visit each archive physically. So there's different stories you can tell through digitizing and making images available and searchable in new ways through online search functions. There's definitely limitations to digitization as far as copyright issues with more modern materials. So, and not everything, I don't think that everything in a collection should be digitized. There's a lot of things to think about as you're prioritizing. And I actually have a whole episode of that in Digitization 101. The very first episode is on prioritization and thinking about different things that would be most important to your collection to digitize and what things may not need as much attention as far as digitization. So it seems like questions have kind of calmed down. So with that, we will thank everyone. And if you think of any questions afterwards, do feel free to email us. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.